Good evening, and welcome to tonight's webinar entitled Components of an Effective, Appropriate IEP. This evening's presentation is being hosted by the Family Support Center of New Jersey and presented by Ira Fingles from the law firm Hinkle, Fingles, and Pryor. Before we begin, let's take a moment to go over how you can participate during today's web event. You each have your own control panel in the upper right corner of your screen that looks similar to the one here. Use the orange arrow to open or hide your control panel. To listen to the webinar, you have two audio options to choose from: mic and speakers, and telephone. If you can't hear well using your computer's speakers, you can elect to use your telephone to listen to the webinar. In order to maintain the best sound quality possible, all but the presenter will be muted throughout the webinar. If you have questions or comments, you can submit them using the questions panel. All questions will be collected and answered at the end of the webinar, as long as time allows. At this time, I would like to welcome Ira Fingles.
Great, thank you.
And we're just making you the presenter now, Ira.
Okay.
And something should pop up and say you're the presenter, and do you want to share your screen?
Yep.
Perfect, we can see your screen.
Okay, and is this when they talk?
This is when you talk.
Great, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank the Family Support Center for organizing this and for all the great work that they do. I'm Ira Fingles, for those who are chuckling over the name, Hinkle, Fingles, and Pryor. That's us. The topic tonight is one that I really enjoy presenting on, because IEPs obviously are an important piece of the special education process that if we don't pay attention to them, things often go okay, and that's good news for a lot of parents. But for parents who are having difficulties, it's often the first place that we try to work, and it becomes a confusing mass of information that parents feel that they need to understand in order to get what they need for their children. And my goal tonight is to try to demystify the IEP process for you and help you understand ways to maximize its effectiveness for your kid. That's us. I'm the guy in the gray suit in the front row between the bald guy and the guy with the beard, if anybody cares. And whenever I'm talking about anything in special education, one of the things that I try to do is keep myself focused on what is the purpose of the law. We deal with a single statute in special education, and I'm not going to play law professor very much, but it's important to know this, that it's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. And in the very beginning of the statute, Congress laid out its goals for children with disabilities and what it was trying to accomplish in putting this legislation together. And Congress identified three things that they were trying to do with the special education system to get kids ready for success after graduation in three specific areas: employment, further education, independent living. Not coincidentally, those are the things that we're trying to do for non-disabled students too, trying to get them ready to go get jobs, go on to college or trade school or some other skill-building activity after graduation, and get out of our houses, go on to live as independently as they're able. We have the same goals for students with disabilities, and our job as parents and as educators and professionals around the IEP table is to try to make sure that every second that we spend working with a kid with a disability in the context of his or her IEP is targeted towards those goals. So we need to make sure that whatever we're doing is helping the child move towards those goals of being successful after graduation to the extent their abilities allow in employment, further education, and in independent living. The way that Congress chose to carry out those goals, or to try to accomplish those goals, was by guaranteeing students a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. A free, appropriate public education is defined as special education and related services that are provided at no cost delivered pursuant to an IEP, which is what we'll be discussing tonight, and designed to meet the unique educational needs of the student. When we talk about a free, appropriate public education, the debate that we often get into is what is appropriate, and parents and educators and administrators around the IEP table don't necessarily know that there is a definition in the law of what is an appropriate IEP. An appropriate IEP is, and this is a mouthful, but we're going to break it down and dig into it a little bit. It's an IEP that's reasonably calculated to confer significant and meaningful benefit in all areas of educational need. Significant and meaningful benefit we can break down into different terms. Benefit in education terms means progress. If we're trying to allow a child to benefit from his or her education, then we want to provide services that allow the child to progress, to increase his skills from one skill level to another skill level, to a higher skill level. For an IEP to be appropriate, it has to be designed to result in significant and meaningful progress. These are terms that aren't self-defining, and that gives those around the table the opportunities to craft for themselves their own definitions of what's significant and what's meaningful for each child. Particularly parents get to weigh in at this stage of the process to decide whether the amount of progress that's expected under an IEP is enough, whether we're going to consider it to be significant and meaningful, or whether it's not. Significant and meaningful lies somewhere between two extremes. At the bottom end of the extreme is no progress or trivial or de minimis progress. At the other end of the extreme, school districts aren't required to provide services that maximize the child's progress. So we need to find that sweet spot in between trivial or de minimis progress and maximized progress, where we think the appropriate amount of benefit lies. When we're making this determination, then we need to take into account the student's potential to make progress. So this means that it's going to change from student to student, that a student with significant cognitive impairments, we may be thrilled if that child's able to make 2 months of progress towards the achievement of math goals in the period of a year. That may be wonderful achievement for that student. For a child with average or above average intellectual potential, we wouldn't be happy with that, and we would look for at least year-to-year advancement, grade-to-grade advancement in academic skills. An important concept that's embodied in that definition of appropriate education is that the benefit must be conferred in all areas of educational need. What this means is that we're not just going to look at academic skills, but we're going to look at all skill areas that are impacted by the child's disabilities. Excuse me, if we remember what the goal is that we're trying to find the services that are going to allow the student to succeed after graduation in employment, further education, independent living. So if we can find any skill deficits that are related to the child's disability that may prevent the student from succeeding after graduation in one of those three skill areas or areas of achievement, then that's an area of educational need that needs to be addressed in the IEP. So certainly we're going to look at academics, reading, writing, math, core content areas, but we're also going to look at all other aspects of the child's development: social skills, emotional functioning, behavioral functioning, physical functioning, adaptive, self-care, daily living skills, sensory, everything else except two things that are carved out. The two things that are carved out are medical services. Medical services, we have a very easy to apply definition. A medical service is one that under state law has to be delivered by an MD. If the service that we're talking about does not have to be delivered by an MD, then it's not a medical service, so we don't need to carve it out. That means that when we get the answer that the child doesn't require additional occupational therapy because the additional therapy sessions are needed for medical purposes, that's not accurate, because occupational therapy services are provided by an occupational therapist who doesn't have a medical degree and isn't required to have a medical degree. So medical excuses for things like occupational therapy, psychological services, counseling, behavior therapy, none of those things work, because if a service doesn't have to be provided by an MD under state law, then it needs to be it can't be carved out under the medical service exception. And the other service that we can carve out is religious services, so we're not going to go to our school districts to try to get a bar mitzvah or a first communion for our kids because of the First Amendment that prohibits the intertwining of church and state. Otherwise, anything that we can think of that's going to impact the student's ability to succeed after graduation and employment, further education, and independent living needs to be considered an educational need and needs to be addressed in the IEP. And that's a point I'm going to keep coming back to as we go through tonight, because I really want parents in particular to understand that education for students with disabilities is very broad, as it is for students without disabilities. It's no less broad for non-disabled kids, but for kids with disabilities, we have a very clear mandate that we need to address all skill areas that are going to get in the way of the kid's success after graduation. Another key concept that we run into in the IEP development process is the concept of developing the student's program before placement. And this doesn't come as common sense to many people because we're all placement centric. We all have the idea that the end goal in the IEP process is trying to figure out the school that the child's going to go to or the class that the child's going to be in, and we sometimes skip over the steps that lead to that. But one of the main messages to get through tonight is that the IEP process, if it's followed in the order that we're going to go through it, and if the IEP is built in the way that Congress intended it to be built, then we're going to do all of this without getting caught up in the question of what school the student's going to be in or what class the student's going to be in until we figure out everything else in the student's IEP. And the reason for that is we want to make sure that decisions about services are made solely with respect to the child's individual needs and not with any consideration given to items such as cost, the availability of staff, space limitations, administrative convenience. One of my favorite excuses, we don't do that here, we've never done that here. Those things don't get in the way of a child being entitled to whatever it is that he or she is entitled to. So, for example, a child who requires 3 sessions of speech therapy per week should have an IEP that reflects a need for 3 sessions of speech therapy per week before we get into the question of can the speech therapist in the XYZ school provide 3 sessions of speech therapy per week. If that speech therapist can only provide 2 sessions per week, and we take that into consideration when we're developing the IEP, then we may end up with an IEP that only says 2 sessions when the student really needs an IEP that says he needs 3 sessions. So let's get the 3 sessions down and then figure out how to get those 3 sessions for him. The IEP is developed by a team. The team includes, most significantly to me as an attorney who represents parents of kids with disabilities, parents, also a special education teacher of the child. That means a teacher who has knowledge of the child and who's taught the child, if a teacher is available, who has taught the child. A regular education teacher of the child, if the child is or is planned to spend any time in a regular education environment. An LEA representative, and I forgot to spell out in an earlier slide what an LEA is. An LEA is a local educational agency, which in New Jersey is a school district. So a representative from the school district who's familiar with the district's resources is able to commit the resources and is able to interpret evaluation data. That's the role of the LEA representative on the IEP team. The child, when appropriate, and the law provides the beginning with the IEP that's in effect when the child is 14, the student is invited to the IEP meeting. It remains up to the parents whether the student attends the IEP meeting. That continues through age 18. At age 18 in New Jersey, the rights of the parents transfer to the adult student, and that's something to think about with kids who don't have the abilities to participate meaningfully in their IEP processes. Then we need to make sure that steps are taken when the child's 18 to keep the parents in a participatory and controlling role in the IEP process through either powers of attorney or guardianship, which is the subject of other presentations that we often give, and others. The others is an important thing to take away from this, that you're welcome as parents or anybody involved in the IEP process to bring people to the IEP meeting who are knowledgeable about the child or who are helpful in any way. One thing that I always recommend to parents is if you have private evaluators, private therapy providers, neighbors who know about the system, bring them to the meeting. Let them help you out when you're sitting at the table and it's you know, parents, and then a whole array of professionals on the other side of the table. Not that it's us against them or that that's the beginning of, you know, a war that you'll never win because of the numbers, but the more people that you have on your side of the table who can help you with whatever goals it is you have for that IEP meeting, the more likely it is that you'll achieve those goals. So you're welcome to bring anybody to the meeting that you think would be helpful, and the district can't limit the number of people that you bring or the types of people that you bring to the meeting, and that can often be helpful to have additional assistance at the meeting. Now, what we're here to talk about, what goes into an IEP, and this slide just runs through very quickly the topics that we're going to cover in subsequent slides. The IEP consists of a number of components: present levels of academic and functional performance, the PLAF, but used to be so much easier when it was present levels of educational performance, the PLEP, now we have PLAF, which is certainly not the easiest thing to say, measurable annual goals, short-term objectives when appropriate, a statement of special education, related services, accommodations, supplementary aids and services, a transition plan when appropriate, and a statement of parental concerns. The IEP is built on information that we have available for the student, and we should gather as much information as we can about the student before the IEP meeting. The sources of information that are commonly used are evaluation results, progress reports, work samples, teacher reports, parent reports, and third-party provider reports. And let me highlight those last two. Parents, you have an important role in the process to bring information into the meeting about how your child is functioning during the 18 hours or so per day, plus all day, Saturday and Sunday, that you're working with the child and that you're spending with the child, and you're able to see how he's functioning and what his skill levels are, and you're bringing in information from a different environment where there's not as much control necessarily, and there's not the same conditions in place as in the school system. So we would expect children to act differently outside of school, and that functioning outside of school is critical in understanding whether or not the skills that are being learned in the school setting are being generalized. And that's a issue we'll talk about a little bit more later, but it's important that we make sure that we have the whole child's functioning landscape available for the IEP team, and that's often up to parents to fill in those huge gaps that exist after 3 o'clock and before 9 o'clock the next day. And third-party providers, if your child is working with a therapist or a private evaluator or some professional outside of the school system, those people can often provide very useful information about what the child's skill levels are in different situations, using different materials, using different techniques, and all of that goes into what shapes this child's learning profile at the time of the IEP meeting. The first section of the IEP that we run into after we get past the demographic page, which is name, rank, serial number, is the present levels of performance, the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. And I've called this the starting point because the way that IEPs have been designed, there are two features of IEPs that are very specifically and clearly intended, that it's stated by Congress, it's been confirmed by courts, that the purpose of present levels of performance and goals and objectives is to bring parents into the IEP process, to bring them into the process of understanding what the child is doing in school, of understanding what it is that we're trying to achieve in terms of advancing the child's skills, the higher levels to get them ready to achieve those 3 goals of success after graduation and employment, further education, independent living. This is meant to be a way of measuring progress, ensuring that progress is there, but also making it understandable for parents so that parents can be equal participants at the IEP table in figuring out what it is that needs to be decided during the meeting. The present level section is a snapshot of the child's status at the time of the IEP. So the goal is to describe the student's abilities in all areas of educational need. That goes back to the prior slide that we're going to look at every area of functioning that's impacted by the child's disabilities that may get in the way of success after graduation in those 3 skill areas. And we need to know where is the student as of the date of this meeting with respect to each of those functioning areas. So academics, we're certainly going to look at. We're going to make sure that the IEP accurately reflects the student's functioning and academic skills. We're also looking at functional achievement. The law doesn't define functional achievement, but it's clear in the cases interpreting the law. And this section of the law was added in 2004, so we've had 11 years of cases now interpreting what that additional language means. And it's clear that that additional language goes to these non-academic areas of functioning that can be so critical to a child's success or lack of success after graduation, like social skills, like behavior, like self-care skills. All those fall under the rubric of functional achievement. And we're going to describe the student's skills in these areas in a way that is specific, observable, objective, and measurable. The goal of describing skills in that way, specific, observable, objective, and measurable, is, from my point of view, the easiest way to state it is that we're not going to have arguments around the table about whether the student can or can't do something. If we're specific, we state things in observable terms that we can see, that you don't have to be an educator to know whether or not James does or does not brush his teeth in the morning without assistance or with hand-over-hand assistance, or he does or doesn't have the ability to independently read a passage from a 3rd grade reading book, or whatever the skill area is that we're focusing on. We want to describe it in a way that at the end of the meeting, we're going to know what it is that he's able to do. And we're not going to use qualitative terms in this section of the IEP. And when we're talking about anything that needs to be specific, observable, objective, and measurable, we're going to try our best to stay away from judgment-laden terms like Billy will be able to appropriately read a passage. What does appropriately mean? Billy will behave appropriately. That couldn't be more vague. It doesn't give us anything to hang on to. It doesn't give us the ability to really understand what the other side of the table is saying in terms of what they consider to be appropriate behavior. Social skills is another area that's very difficult to pin down in specific, observable, objective, and measurable terms, but it can be done, and we need to be as clear as we can in these statements, because this is the starting point of the IEP. This is where the student is as of the date that the IEP is being drafted. And if you recall, an appropriate IEP is one that allows the student to progress. How are we going to know if the student's progressing, and at what rate is the student progressing, if we don't know where we're starting? So we need to pin down the starting point as clearly as we're able in terms that we can all see, feel, touch, understand, and not argue about in terms of what they mean or whether or not they actually are or are not being demonstrated. I came up with an example of a statement for social skills for the PLAF section that educators in the audience might chuckle at, because it really is amateurish. It was drawn from lessons that I received from an expert in social skills instruction who suggested to me that social skills is an area that we can be very specific, because my challenge to that point was that I really didn't understand how you could write present level statements and goals and objectives for social skills in ways that are really specific, observable, objective, and measurable. And I think this is close to the example that he gave me. I wish I wrote it down at the time. But what's not measurable, what doesn't fit that definition of specific, observable, objective, and measurable, is Xavier has difficulty with social skills. We may not dispute that that's the case, but it doesn't tell us anything about what level of difficulty he has, in what environments do the difficulties present themselves, how entrenched are the difficulties that he's having, what are the difficulties that he's having. None of that information is in that statement. And I wish I was oversimplifying the types of things that I see in IEPs, but I see plenty of IEPs where the present level section says something to this effect, that Xavier has difficulty with social skills, and that's all we have to start with in the present level section. A different way of approaching that I've offered, and whether it's pedagogically accurate or not, I have no idea, but certainly from my definition of specific, observable, objective, measurable, it's there, that over 10 15-minute observations conducted in unstructured activities during the weeks of October 17 and October 24, Xavier interrupted other students' conversations 12 times. Specific tells us what he did. Observable, it's something that we can see. We can just watch him and see whether or not he's doing it or not. It's objective. There's no judgment words in here. There's no question of whether he did or didn't appropriately handle himself in a social situation. We can decide for ourselves whether it's appropriate or inappropriate to interrupt. I think we would all agree it's inappropriate, but we don't have any of those vague terms in this. And it's measurable because we can watch him during these specified sessions and figure out how many times he's interrupting other students. So that's my effort to help you understand what the law requires in terms of a specific, objective, observable, and measurable statement of a present level of performance. The present levels of performance tie naturally into measurable annual goals. If the present levels of performance is the starting point, then the measurable annual goals is the finish line. That's what we're trying to achieve in implementing the IEP. We want the student to move from whatever level is stated in the present level section to a higher level of functioning, and we decide on what that higher level of functioning is in the annual goals. We choose the annual goals in a way that we want to set them high enough to be significant and meaningful. That's where the significant and meaningful piece of the definition of appropriate comes in, that we need to make sure that whatever level of benefit that we're anticipating from the IEP is actually going to be helpful for the student in reaching those goals of success after graduation and employment, independent living, further education. We need to be careful not to water them down, make them too low. If they're too low, then they'll be easily achieved, which may make the school district feel good or may make it look good, but it doesn't significantly and meaningfully advance the student towards those goals. We don't want to set them too high either. If the goal's not achieved, not only do we not have that skill not being achieved, but we don't really get back as much information about why. We need to make sure that the goals are within reach. We need a measurable annual goal for each of the skill deficits that's identified in the present level section. And this is one of the first things I do when I get an IEP and the parent asks me if it's appropriate. I'll take the present level section and list out the skills that are identified as weaknesses in the present level section, or the areas that are identified as needs, and then I'll go and make sure that there's a goal that addresses each of those needs. Usually there's not. And that, to me, is a big problem. If we're identifying a need in the present level section, then we need to make sure that we're tracking the student's development towards that skill area in the goals and objectives, or in the goals. So we need to make sure there's a goal for each area identified in the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Again, we're going to focus on all skill areas impacted by the student's disability, so everything: academic, social, behavioral, emotional, physical, sensory, everything except medical skills, which by definition are provided by MDs, and religious skills. Otherwise, if it's an area that's identified in the present levels, which it should be if it's going to get in the way of achievement of those goals after graduation, then it needs to be in the present levels, and then we need a corresponding goal in the goals and objectives to address that skill area. And like the present level section, the goals need to be stated in ways that are specific, observable, objective, and measurable. The goal should include assessment criteria so that at the end of the reporting period, we're going to know whether or not the goal has or hasn't been achieved. That's my goal, and this is something that's confirmed in some cases as well, but it's really been my rule of thumb that a well-written IEP with well-written present level section, well-written goals and objectives won't leave you arguing at the end of the IEP period, whatever that may be, of whether or not the student has or hasn't made progress, because these things are going to be so clear. We're all going to agree that the student can or cannot demonstrate the skills that were identified in the goals and objectives, because we're going to make the goals and objectives so specific, observable, objective, and measurable that it's not going to leave room for argument. Whether it's enough, more was required, less is required, that might be debatable, but whether these things are actually happening, we shouldn't have any debate about. So we don't want to have those arguments at the end of the IEP period, meaning the end of the period during which the IEP is being implemented, in which the school district's folks are saying that the skill was accomplished and the parents are saying no, it wasn't. If we have the goals written right, then we're not going to have that argument. We're going to know either the goal was or it wasn't achieved. Simple black and white, on-off binary switch. And for goals, we know what the assessment period is. The law tells us that these are measurable annual goals. Not that there was a need for a court to clarify this, but a court did have to clarify that annual means 12 months. So a goal, by definition, is written in a way that it's meant to be achievable within 12 months. Doesn't mean that it has to be achieved within 12 months, but the idea is this is the level of performance we're going to expect after 12 months of implementation of these services. Short-term objectives are short-term benchmarks towards the completion of the goal. They're not required for all students anymore. This is a change that took effect in 2004 also, and the law was changed so that only students who are taking alternative assessments like the APA in New Jersey are required to have objectives in their IEPs, but the IEPs that I see typically include goals and objectives for all students regardless of whether they take alternative assessments. If objectives are included in the IEP, then they need to meet all of the criteria that we've been talking about: specific, objective, observable, measurable. They need to be reasonable, they need to be appropriate. It's not required that they be in there for many kids, but if they are in there, they do need to be right. By definition, an objective is something that's going to be measured in less than a year because it's a step towards completion of an annual goal. So if the goal is 12 months and we're measuring the student's progress towards the goal, then we need to measure the achievement of the objective in a period of less than 12 months. This is often easy. School districts will often write objectives and say in the first marking period he'll get a quarter of the way towards the goal, and by the second he'll be halfway, and the third he'll be 3/4 of the way, and then all the way by the end of the fourth marking period. And I have no problem with that. And the purpose of including objectives and writing them in that way is so that we don't have to wait a year to figure out whether or not we're going to have a problem achieving the goal. If we have an objective that tells us within 3 months that we should see a quarter year's progress, or let's say 3 months of progress towards the goal, then we have a check-in. After 3 months, we can take a look. Has the student gotten anywhere near 3 months towards the goal? I'm sorry, towards the objective? If the objective is achieved, then good, we move on to the next objective. Maybe the objective was achieved after only a month, and that might suggest to us that the goal was set too easy and that we need to heighten it because the student has the potential to make more progress. That's where the potential comes back into the play and into the mix. That if the student's achieving the goals and objectives very quickly out of the gate, then we probably set the goals and objectives too low, and we can probably expect greater performance from that student. And I would argue, as the parent's advocate and the student's advocate, the student who can achieve objectives at a much faster rate than the IEP team anticipated is entitled to more challenging objectives because potential has to be factored into whether the progress is significant and meaningful. Likewise, if we have a student who gets 3 months into it and is nowhere near achieving that objective, then there's no need to continue laboring for another 9 months just to find out the obvious at the end of the 12 months that the goal, the annual goal, is not going to be achieved. So if we have that warning sign 3 months into the implementation of the IEP that the student's not making it, then we have two choices. We can either lower the goals, which may be appropriate, maybe it's not. Maybe what's needed instead is that we intensify the services or change the approach to allow the student to meet the goals. Maybe the goals were appropriate all along, but the instruction is where the problem is. But it gives us an opportunity to troubleshoot relatively early into the implementation of the IEP to figure out whether or not any changes need to be made midstream, excuse me. And that's a point that I want to make a further point, that IEPs are not written in stone. Once the IEP is written, either side has the ability to reopen the IEP at any point. IEPs are meant to be in effect for a 12-month period. They're meant to be annual documents, meaning that they have to be revised, revisited and revised no less frequently than once per year. But it doesn't mean that if we get 2 months into an IEP and we notice that there are problems, that we can't reopen the IEP and adjust the goals and objectives, or adjust the instruction that's being provided, or change the student's placement, or do whatever's needed to make sure that the IEP continues to be appropriate. It may have been perfectly appropriate when it was written, but some change in circumstance took place. The student changed medications, there was a change in the family environment, there was, God forbid, an accident that drastically impacted the student's functioning levels. All those are good reasons to reopen the IEP before the 12 months are up, and the law says the IEP has to be revised as often as necessary to make sure it's appropriate. And I've had kids who've had very dynamic needs that change very quickly and unpredictably, and we've had to have IEP meetings monthly. Sometimes we have an IEP meeting 1 week and we realize a week into it that we have to have another IEP meeting because something's changed. So we need to keep these things dynamic and moving. They're not static documents. And like the measurable annual goals, the objectives need to include the assessment criteria. So a statement of how progress towards the objective is going to be measured needs to be included in the IEP. And like everything else, it needs to be specific, objective, observable, and measurable. We're not going to rely, to the extent that we're able to get away from relying on things like teacher report, no disrespect to teachers, but I would much rather see some type of more formalized check-in. Autism lends itself to this with the applied behavior analysis methodology that requires continual data collection on behaviors, whether they're inappropriate behaviors or productive behaviors. Knowing what the student's doing on a day-by-day basis gives the team all the information that they need to know what's happening at any point in time. And that data-based methodology can be applied to any skill area, not necessarily just for kids with autism and not necessarily just with respect to behavior. It may not show up in the same rigorous scientific way that we see in strict ABA programs, but we can have periodic check-ins using objective data-based instruments to see how students performing. And the example I'll go back to is Xavier and his propensity to interrupt conversations. That a goal for Xavier that would not be measurable and wouldn't meet the criteria that I'm laying out is Xavier will not interrupt other students. Great goal, but goals shouldn't be aspirational life statements. One of the goals that sticks with me 15 years, 20 years after I first saw it is that a student will respond appropriately to authority. And I always thought that was an interesting goal because I think that's a great example of a government agency trying to form a student into a citizen that the government would like to see, and that would be great if we all responded appropriately to authority. Those of you who may know me know that sometimes I don't do that. I really do when we're in court. Don't be afraid of that. But it's not necessarily something that is going to be useful in the IEP context to help a student understand what behavior or what level of performance is expected of them, or to help the student's parents understand what's expected. A measurable way of dealing with Gabriel's difficulty of interrupting other students would be over 10, 15-minute observations conducted in unstructured activities over a 2-week period. Xavier will not interrupt other students' conversations. That, to me, again, feels more akin to the specific observable, objective, and measurable types of information that we're looking for from goals and objectives. It doesn't have to be that Xavier will not interrupt other students' conversations. Maybe he'll bring his level of interruption down from 12 occurrences, which is what we saw in the present levels, to 6 occurrences. Maybe we'll bring it down from 12 to 11. Maybe that's a great achievement if we can get that simple reduction in his propensity to interrupt. And this is a silly example. I'm sorry that for those of you who've noticed it, and I'm sorry for those of you who didn't, that now I've pointed out to you. But when it becomes more complex behaviors that we're looking at, these same principles apply, just the content will be different. So we have a structure of the IEP. At the beginning, we have present levels of performance, which tell us where the student is at the time of the IEP. Then we have goals and objectives that tell us where we would like the student to be so that he can make the progress or she can make the progress that we feel is significant and meaningful and therefore appropriate under the definition of appropriate that an IEP is reasonably calculated to confer significant and meaningful benefit in all areas of educational need. So we have a starting point, we have an end point. Now we need to fill in the details of how do we get from point A to point B, and not surprisingly, the main way that we get from point A to point B is through special education. And this is something I am always disappointed that I have to spend time on in a presentation like this, and I'm sorry if there's anybody from the State Department of Education listening or anybody who's got friends in the State Department of Education, but this is a New Jersey problem. We have IEPs that don't include special education. I practice in Pennsylvania, I've practiced some in Florida, I've seen IEPs in New Hampshire and Vermont, Wisconsin. I've been able to see other states' approaches to writing IEPs, and almost to a T, they have these detailed statements of special education services in the IEPs. When I look at a New Jersey IEP, the statement of special education services in the IEP is typically a placement, and that's really disappointing. That statement where it should be laying out what specific services will we be providing to help the student go from present levels to goal or objective, instead just says where the student's going to be, which is a complete mixing up of program and placement. We need the program before we even think about the placement. The placement is not special education. It's where special education is delivered, but a resource room is not special education. Special education is not a place. I'll get off my high horse with that. Special education is specially designed instruction to meet the unique learning needs resulting from the child's disabilities. Seems obvious. The IEP should spell out the specific special education services that will be provided to the student to allow him or her to progress towards the achievement of those goals and objectives. We have different things that are included in the IEP, and they all look a lot like special education. And school districts, when I cross-examine them in due process hearings, some of their personnel get these things confused, whether a service is special education or is it a related service, or is it a supplementary aid and service, or is it accommodation? And it's accommodations where I see the most confusion. So I'm going to draw a distinction here, and we'll come back to it when we talk about accommodations. Special education are specialized services to help a student overcome the limiting effects of his or her disabilities. An easy example is a student with a disability of written expression needs specialized instruction to learn how to write better. That's instruction targeted towards improving the student's ability to produce written output. We'll see in the accommodation section how this can get confused with other ways of addressing a writing disability. But special education is specially designed instruction, which means instruction that's modified either in the manner it's delivered, in the content, in the sequence. Any modification to the instruction that's provided to the regular education students now becomes special education. This is what special ed teachers learn how to do, and they learn to do it with great effect in their educational programs and through their careers. This is the heart of the special education system, special education. Sorry I have to say this, but we need IEPs in New Jersey that are going to include special education services, statements of services, so that we can have a discussion about what services are going to be provided. It's not going to be left entirely up to the teacher's discretion in the classroom to decide this critical piece of the IEP. IEPs also include, when appropriate, related services. Related services are defined as services that are provided to allow a student to benefit from his or her special education program. An easy and obvious example of a service that allows a student to benefit from education: transportation. A student can't benefit from the special education that's being provided, no matter how good the special education is, if the student can't get to school. So transportation is the first related service that's listed. What I did here is I just took this right from the statute. and I listed all the related services that are given as examples, and these are examples. The statute's very clear that related services can include but are not limited to these things, and the reason that I listed it isn't so we can talk about it right now, but so that you can take a look at it and see if any of it feels like something that your child might benefit from that hasn't come up around the IEP table. And there's two that I'll point out that I think are really interesting and show just how broad and deep the obligations of school districts go towards addressing things that we don't consider to be educational in most situations with non-disabled students, but for kids with disabilities, these can be of critical importance. And one is recreation, including therapeutic recreation. The definition that the law gives of that is recreation services are services to help assess a student's leisure functioning and to teach the student how to use leisure time appropriately. Doesn't seem obvious for a lot of kids. Most kids without disabilities don't have a hard time figuring out what to do during their time off. They know how to have fun. They know how to unwind. They know how to engage with peers and to do the things that they're inclined to do with their time off. Kids with autism, you let them have time off, and often they'll just spin, they'll focus on their fingers tapping or rocking or shaving the cat or chasing their brother around the house and throwing him out the window. All not great ways to spend leisure time. And kids with autism and kids with all kinds of other disabilities need to know what to do with their downtime, because everybody uses downtime to more or less productive means, but a student whose disability prevents him from being able to have that downtime may need that, because that's been found to be critically important in making sure that a person is overall well-balanced, healthy, emotionally well. So that's one example that I think is striking, that districts are required when appropriate to help students learn how to do nothing. And the other one is the last one, parent counseling and training. Districts are obligated to provide services to students' parents to help them understand their children's disabilities and to help them be able to support the provision of the services that are being provided in the school, in the IEP. This, in a lot of ways, focuses on generalization, that a student learns things during school. Non-disabled students come home from school and they may get some help from their parents on homework, and that's all they need because they don't have disabilities. A kid with a disability may require much more assistance from the parents than just sitting down and saying, don't forget to do your math homework tonight. To the extent the parents are going to be part of the solution of the student's educational needs, then they need training to that effect, and they're entitled to get that through the IEP. And I bring these two up because it's always interesting to me when parents bring these things up at the IEP table and the school administrators look at each other and they say, oh, we don't do that. We've never been asked to do that. We don't know what to do with that. And to the extent that they're going to claim that that's not their responsibility, Congress found differently. They wrote it specifically into the law. Some of these other things you might find helpful for your kids as well. Supplementary aids and services are a different type of service, and now we have special education services that are targeted towards improving this child's skills in the areas impacted by his disabilities. Related services, which provide supportive services to allow the child to succeed based upon the services that are being provided in special education. Now we have a third type of service that's provided, a supplementary aid and service. These are aid services and other supports. They're provided in regular education settings, other education-related settings, and in extracurricular and non-academic settings for one specific purpose. Supplementary aids and services are provided to allow a student to be educated with non-disabled children. A service that's provided solely for the purpose of allowing a child to go into a less restrictive educational setting is a supplementary aid and service. An example that I can give of a supplementary aid and service that, the point is that the same service may be different things in different situations, but a student may require a sign language interpreter as a related service to allow him or her to benefit from the instruction that's being provided by the special education teacher who may not know sign language. In that situation, because it's being provided to allow the student to benefit from special education, it's a related service. What about a sign language instructor interpreter that's provided in a regular education class so that the student can communicate with other kids in the class, and the student can communicate with the instructional assistants and people that aren't necessarily teaching the student, but with whom the student needs to be able to interact to be in that class successfully? That becomes a supplementary aid and service, something that's provided so that the student can be in that less restrictive setting. And that opens up a whole world of services that we can ask for if we want to preserve a less restrictive placement or secure a less restrictive placement. Then supplementary aids and services come to the forefront of how can we make sure that this student can receive the full range of benefit of being in this less restrictive class. And if we need services to allow the student to be in there and to be successful, they become supplementary aids and services, which is a separate category of services under the IEP. There's a page with examples of supplementary aids and services that I just lifted from another PowerPoint that I did, and I didn't want to leave it because I put a lot of work into it the first time around. I'm not going to go through it except to point out that there's three types of supplementary aids and services that are identified here. One are direct services to the student, such as a sign language interpreter. One are supports for the environment, like taking down distracting things hanging from the walls or mobiles hanging from the ceiling for a kid who's got issues of distractibility. And the third is training for the staff and others involved in the kids' education to help them understand the students' needs. And others involved in the kids' education might mean other kids in the classroom, providing training to them to understand the students' disabilities, to understand what the students' needs are as a learner in that educational environment. This is one of my favorites. It was added in 2004, and I'm sure nobody cares that it's my favorite, but the point is to get your attention back, because I just gave you that big long list of supplementary aids and services. In 2004, the law was changed to require that special education, related services, and supplementary aids and services be based to the extent practicable on methods that have been proven effective through peer-reviewed research. This was a huge step forward in many areas because we've been arguing for years, and I gave two examples where these arguments come up. Applied behavior analysis therapy for kids with autism and spectrum disabilities. ABA is not just for autism, but it's certainly the primary means of addressing autism these days. And an Orton-Gillingham type program for a kid with dyslexia or a reading disability. These are things that before the law was changed in 2004, school districts were coming back and saying, oh, we don't have to provide an ABA program for this student because we provide an eclectic approach. We use a little bit of ABA. We use a little bit of TEACH. We use a little bit of floor time. We use a little bit of natural environment teaching, and that's our prerogative, to mix things up and to provide what we think is the right mix of services, because we don't have to just go by one playbook. And what this provision in the statute did is told school districts, if there's a research base that shows that one methodology is appropriate based upon peer-reviewed research, you got to use it. What came out of that is ABA is the only methodology that's been proven effective through peer-reviewed research to help kids with autism increase their skills. There is no support for those eclective programs, and in fact the eclective programs are trashed in the literature. There's study after study after study after study showing that eclective programs for students with autism don't work, that they don't produce gains in any measurable way, whereas students who receive intensive, rigorous ABA programs, which doesn't mean just discrete trial teaching, let's get that out of our heads, but students who receive intensive ABA programs improve their skills in measurable, scientifically proven ways. Kids who get eclectic programs don't. So now school districts are much harder pressed to put an eclectic program out there because they don't have the backing of peer-reviewed research. And the same with Orton-Gillingham. There were all kinds of other approaches to teaching kids with dyslexia how to read. Orton-Gillingham programs and Orton-Gillingham based programs like Stevenson or Wilson have been proven effective through peer-reviewed research, and to my knowledge, there is no other approach other than Orton and Orton derivatives that work for kids with dyslexia. So the law now gives us a very solid foothold to say, what are you proposing and what are you basing it on? What research are you relying on? If there is no research, that's where the practicable work comes in. To the extent that they're able to base it on peer-reviewed research, they have to. There's some areas where the research isn't that clear, or the research might support multiple methodologies, and they can choose one, even though you may have another methodology that's got more research. This doesn't resolve those problems cleanly, but it certainly gives you a foothold to argue that the research base needs to be brought into the discussion, and the district has the burden of demonstrating that the research is there to support whatever they're doing, assuming that research is there. A little bit circular, but try it at the table. It works. Accommodations. This is where I started with special education. Accommodations, special education, if you remember, are services to help a student overcome the limiting effects of his disability. So a student who has difficulty writing is taught to write. That's special education. We're going directly at the problem by providing services to improve the student's skill in that area. That's going to be a problem in those areas after graduation. An accommodation is a service, support, or modification provided to assist a child in working around the limiting effects of the disabilities. So in our example of a kid with a disability of written expression, instruction in keyboarding. It doesn't necessarily teach the child how to write. It may. That's not a great example, I'm realizing. Okay, I apologize. How about using a reader for reading activities? A student who has difficulties with reading can be taught how to read more effectively, but we can also provide a reader for the student to read passages to him. It doesn't help him learn how to read. It does make sure that he gets the content that's in the reading. So if the goal of the class lesson is to teach the child to read, then we're going to provide special education to allow the student to read the passage him or herself. If the goal of the class lesson is to allow the student to understand what's in a written passage and be able to use that knowledge through the rest of the lesson, then maybe we want to have it read to them. That becomes an accommodation because we're working around the reading difficulty. We're not going directly to it.
Ira, this is Yvonne. I'm sorry to interrupt. Hi. I just wanted to just chime in here and let you know that it's just about 8 o'clock, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to provide a question and answer session if that's something you were interested in doing at this time.
I am happy to do that, Yvonne. I only have a couple more slides. I can knock them out real quick, and then can we do questions and answers?
Absolutely.
Okay, and I'll do them super quick because these aren't IEP related.
Great.
But the educational placement, this is where we now get to think about where the student goes to school. After we decided everything else, now let's figure out where the student's going to be. This is the first time least restrictive environment should come into the discussion. And the point that I want to make is that the least restrictive environment needs to be appropriate to the student's needs. So if the environment we're looking at can't provide the appropriate program that we just came up with through the rest of this IEP process, it's not the least restrictive environment, even if it's in the home school, even if it's with non-disabled kids. If it can't give the kid the services that he needs that we've already decided are appropriate because we haven't thought about placement yet, this is where we're going to not allow that appropriate program to be watered down to get the kid into a less restrictive setting. You need appropriate and least restrictive transition plan. Why don't we just do another workshop on transition planning so we can skip this. And parent concerns, this is a section of the IEP that is parents' opportunity to weigh in with what they think is helpful for enhancing their students' education. And the two suggestions I have is come with something prepared or prepared after the meeting and ask that be included. Don't leave it to the school district to paraphrase what you're saying verbally at the meeting. And don't get personal. It's really a bad place to put down your concerns that this teacher has it in for your kid or doesn't have enough training. Try to keep it, focused on the needs. If the student needs somebody with better training, we can say that. We don't need to say that this teacher is deficient in some way. And that's my thing. So questions and answers. I'm ready to go.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ira, for sharing your valuable knowledge and expertise with us. And we did have some questions that came in for you. So the first being, if one at the school feels that a student who has an IEP is depressed, is there anything the school can do? This attendee is wondering in particular if emotional needs fall under that all areas of educational needs category.
Absolutely, they do. And, you know, emotional needs, and I'm going to use my lawyer test that I look at whether or not what we're looking for needs to come from an ND. If we're thinking about antidepressant medication, then we don't do that through the Iep process, obviously. But if we're thinking about counseling, psychological services, any types of services that are going to help with the depression, assessment services, then that squarely falls within the world of educational responsibility. And depression, unfortunately, robs so many kids not only of their happiness during childhood, but their ability to learn during childhood. And more we're seeing team members, and I appreciate the questioners picking up on this. It sounds like somebody from the system that's asking, and absolutely it's appropriate to identify those needs, figure out what's needed to address them.
Thank you so much. And the next question is, social skills seem to be difficult to figure into this person's child's full high school schedule. So how can this be addressed with the team?
Wow, I love that question, because now we're getting into, you know, what does individualized instruction really look like? For a kid without disabilities, they get social skills instruction throughout the day. If Johnny's pulling Cindy's hair, dipping her pigtails in the inkwell, and I have no idea why I always use that example, you know, the teacher's going to help Johnny not do that. If Johnny needs more intensive services from a professional who specializes in social skills instruction, we need to make sure that's part of the IEP. And we run into these problems in later years that early years social skills is built into the program, but later years the kids who need intensive social skills filter out to specialized schools. The kids with less intensive needs often go unaddressed, but we can do it obviously during lunch, although I'm not a big fan of lunch bunch. We can do it after school. Parents are absolutely entitled and required to look at breaching that, you know, 8:30 to 2:30 school day. So if we can't fit it during the school day, we can look at after school. We can look at weekends. We can talk about arrangements where the parents provide the therapy privately and get reimbursed by the school district. But what the last thing we want to do is leave those social skill needs unaddressed just because it doesn't fit in with the school day that we've designed to meet the needs of non-disabled students.
Thank you so much. The next question is, does the school have the right to expel a student or send them to another more restrictive setting due to behaviors?
It's a really complicated area of discipline, which I love because it's so complicated, and I've had to take the time to get to know it, and I think it really makes sense. It's not an easy answer. On expulsion, for a kid with an IEP, and this doesn't necessarily go for 504 kids, kids with IEPs can't be expelled, meaning that they're put out and no services are provided. Districts can try to move them into different settings to give them services to address whatever it was that gave rise to the disciplinary action, and there's two ways that they can do it. One is to say that the student needs those intensified services so that we don't have future instances of behavioral difficulties. The other is to do it as punishment, and the law treats those situations differently. If it's being done as punishment because the student needs to be removed from the school environment, so we're going to put him into an alternative school for 3 months or for a year or for the rest of his educational life, then there's different standards that apply than if the team is just trying to move the kid to a setting that is believed to be more able to handle those behavioral issues. So it's a complicated answer, but absolutely expulsion is not allowed for kids with IEPs, and parents should be wary, I think, that when kids are put out of regular ed settings and into alternative schools, a lot of times it backfires because we have a lot of kids that have the similar problems of not being able to behave in ways that we want them to, now all grouped together in a building so they can teach each other how to start fires better. It may not be the best approach. With that said, there are some great behavioral schools that, it's all case by case.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions for you. We do have a time for about 3 more, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay, great. So this is in reference to your slide on the IEP team. If the child is of age to be a part of the meeting but has no interest in attending, does he have to attend?
No. No. Kids don't have to go to meetings. And, I hate sounding, anti-kid or whatever, but I generally encourage parents not to bring their kids unless there's a really good reason to bring them, because the kids, if you have a kid who's very involved and very self-aware, that could be a great addition to the team. But if you have a kid that's going to be confused by the process or may feel marginalized or, even worse, be offended or discouraged in his or her abilities, then there's no need to have that person at the table.
Okay. This one is, my child has an eye tracking disability and receives no alternative assistance. This individual was told that there are no visual assessments in New Jersey, so they're thinking that no help can be had for their child. Is that true?
Nah, there's developmental optometrists all over the state, and the ones that I've worked with have blown me away with how well they can assess things like eye tracking and visual acuity and the things that get in the way of reading. And it's amazing when you have a kid who's got what seems to be an entrenched reading problem, and you find out that it's really an ocular motor problem, an eye motor movement problem. Then when you get the kid the assistance with the eye motor movement, all of a sudden you learn that there is no disability in reading. It's a disability in moving the eyes. There are plenty of assessments. If you look at the list of related services, medical assessments are required. Assessments for identification and, diagnostic and evaluation purposes. So the school district can be responsible for the developmental optometrist. It's a subject near and dear to my heart. My dad was an optometrist, and he had a subspecialty in doing that stuff. So, no, there's plenty of people in New Jersey. I don't know how you find them. I do have some names. If anybody wants to email me, I can tell people that who I've used or seen used in the past who seem good. But
great, thank you so much. And we have time for one more question. If a student doesn't reach the objective or goal, how do you determine if the goal is too high or the method of instruction is the problem?
Yeah, I love the question because, as the cynic, my immediate thought is always the school district screwed it up somehow, which is why school districts love me so much. But it's really, I think, it's a team process, being able to figure out, were we off track when we thought that this skill could be achieved in 12 months or whatever the objective period was? And maybe we were. Maybe our sights were set too high, and there's not a problem with saying the sight's too high as long as we're able to ratchet them back as needed. But oftentimes it's going, I can't say most of the time, but plenty of time it's going to be the instruction. And one great resource parents have are outside evaluators that they can pay themselves or they can get as an independent evaluation through their school district. So somebody not connected with the school district who might be a little more candid in assessing the actual instruction and being able to say, you know what, it's the right type of instruction, it's the right objective, it's the right goal, but it's just not being implemented the way that it needs to be for the child to actually succeed, which is the goal. So that's one suggestion, is getting an expert to come in and help figure out that kind of very fine, detailed problem.
Okay, well, again, thank you so much, Ira, for the valuable information that you provided us this evening. And this does bring us to the end of our session. So on behalf of the Family Support Center of New Jersey and Ira Fingles of Hinkle, Fingles, and Pryor, I'd like to thank you for attending this evening's webinar.
Thank you all.
Have a wonderful night.